Hey everyone, in this Grim Dawn video, we are going to be looking at how to gain resistances with your character when approaching things like Elite and Ultimate. So this is going to kind of be a more relaxed video. I'm not going to be showing fancy footage or anything like that. It's going to be one of these, I sit here and discuss a topic for about 10 minutes videos. And we're talking resistances. So when you enter Elite and later Ultimate, your resistances will take a negative hit. I believe in Elite it is minus 25 or something like that to your main row. And then in Ultimate it's minus 50 and then minus 25, I want to say, to your second row. You can see the specifics on the game guide. I probably should have looked that up before doing this video. But suffice it to say, your resistances take a hit. So when you go from normal / veteran to Elite and then to Ultimate, you have to rebuild your resistances in order to survive. In Elite, this is a little tricky, but it's not that difficult to deal with, since you're not going to be hit that hard by the enemies in Elite. You can probably still get by in whatever like level 50-ish gear you get for that difficulty. Entering Ultimate, though, it does get a little more difficult just to survive with this negative penalty going on. This is also why I suggest entering Ultimate at level 70. With at least Homestead and the Rovers at Revered. Because once you hit level 70 with those two at Revered, and with other factions at Revered, you gain access to the armor augments. And these are all about giving you resistances. And this is the primary way I fill in all the blanks on my resistances after gearing and abilities. So you can see I have Poison and Pierce, or I should say Pierce and Poison, Pierce and Poison, Poison, more Pierce and Poison, Pierce, Poison, and oh, there's Cold Lightning. So, yeah, this character obviously didn't get a lot of Pierce resistance from his gear, or his abilities, or a lot of poison resistance even though I'm wearing a Tinker's Ingenuity. And that's why I went mostly with those augments on him, in order to get poison a little overcapped and just have Pierce sitting right next to its cap. So that's step one to building your resistances. And really it's going to end up being the last step. I'm just covering it here first, because you're generally going to have your gear, and you'll know what resistances you need more of, and you'll go from faction to faction, looking at what they provide, and then using those to fill in the blanks. Generally speaking, though, I like to have Homestead and the Rovers at Revered when I enter Ultimate. They're really easy to get to Revered as well. Undead are pretty easy to fight in Elite for the Rovers, and in Beast, you just fight a crap ton of them throughout the game anyways. So you'll eventually get Homestead. You'll probably get it really quickly, especially once you get the writs, the little bonus things for it. And if you can pass on the big ones from characters that are already revered to your sub-characters, it goes really, really fast. So that will get you your resistances capped out, essentially. But before the armor augments, for gearing, there are kind of three pieces I use on a lot of characters to get a good chunk of my resistances out of the way. The first is Tinker's Ingenuity. It's a belt. It gives you a lot of poison and bleeding resistance, and will actually increase the maximum poison and bleed resistance you can have. It's craftable is the big thing. And not only is it craftable, it's easily craftable. It requires scrap, Bindings of Bismiel, Ancient Armor Plate, Mark of the Traveler. These three are really, really common. And obviously scrap is really common. So you can just make a crap ton of Tinker's Ingenuities as you need them. The other big item I go to grab is Mark of Divinity. It'll give you 25 elemental res, plus 3 on your maximum res for your elemental resistances. And it has a great proc. Oh, and I'm going to point out, the proc on Tinker's Ingenuity is really awesome as well. When you drop below 40% health, you'll get 15% energy absorption, and you'll deal bonus damage and have bonus health and energy regen. That's just an all-around solid ability to get, you know, every 22 seconds. And then Market of Divinity's proc is pretty sweet as well. You get a little heal, and you get 100% damage absorption when your health drops below 30%. And that's really awesome to have for 3 seconds every 90 seconds. So these two items are just all around great pieces of resistance gear, and have great procs. Additionally, Golemborn Greaves will give you, in my case, 49 Pierce Res, and then a chunk of physical resistance as well. And physical resistance is pretty handy to have for dealing with enemies that come into melee range against you, that, you know, mostly swing their weapons at you. But the Pierce Res, it's a huge chunk of Pierce Res, and that'll definitely help you fill out your Pierce resistance. The Golemborn ability is pretty solid as well. A nice chunk of armor will help you survive a little better. Though the internal trauma damage retaliation is okay. Reduced attack speed retaliation is not bad as well. It's a nice little bit of survival added on to everything else. So what's going to happen when you gear your character, and I'll point this out just looking at my gear here real quick, is if you have a piece of gear that is generally leaning towards an elemental type, or I should say a damage type, you'll probably end up with some resistance to that damage type. So the Outcast Secret, the helmet here, is a primarily Aether damage helmet. Of course, because it gives you % Aether damage, has that Devastation proc, and it gives you some Aether resistance. And that kind of holds true for a lot of gear in the game. You can see my Aether Touch gloves, they have Aether resistance because they're Aether gear. It's not always true, but it's true on a lot of things. But also by filling out your gear slots with just solid gear, you'll probably fill out a lot of your resistances as well. So Aether Reach has elemental resistance, which is, you know, obviously really great to pick up. Because that elemental resistance applies to all fire, lightning, and cold damage. But sometimes they won't line up. So the Wraithborn leggings here, they're Aether damage, but you'll get vitality resistance and bleeding resistance out of these pants. So sometimes you'll end up with a piece of gear that goes towards your character's build, and the resistances on them will be not what that build does damage-wise. It'll be sort of like offshoot resistance. And those will help you fill in like some off resistances. And this is kind of true for a lot of gear in the game, where it'll sometimes really be focused on a damage type, or you'll end up being focused on a damage type, but it'll ping some other things here and there. So the Iskandra set, the shoulders have Aether Res and Elemental Res. I mean, it's Fire Aether shoulders, of course, they'll ping those two. The Amulet has its elemental damage, and it pings fire and cold. And it gives you bonus to all max res. Or I should say, all resistances maximum. And then the chest piece has that little bit of chaos damage for that sort of not elemental damage resistance bonus. And I mean, the rings are another example of the, oh, this is pinging a not Aether chaos res thing. It's Albrecht's Duality gives you elemental resistance. So when I look for resistances on a character, usually you'll get a lot of them filled in just with your gearing. And actually going forward, this is going to be the case for more and more gear, because Crate is going to be sort of tweaking the resistances that shows up on rings to make the rings more relevant and to actually have rings carry resistance. Because I know some of them don't actually carry it right now. Or I should say, the resistances are going to be made better if they exist already, just so people can gear their survivability a little better. And you can see another example of the Aether damage thing giving Aether resistance is Empowered Aetherlord Signet. Does just that. So just to point in another set, the Clairvoyant set will ding Aether Res, Chaos Res and Elemental Res, Vitality Res and Elemental Res, and more Vitality Res. So with this, you'd get, you know, Aether, Chaos, Elemental, Vitality. You'd cover these three, you'd cover your Vitality, you'd cover Aether, and you'd cover a little bit of Chaos. So what I'd be searching for again in my armor augments would be the Poison Pierce stuff. Now, bleeding res, pretty much you're gonna have to rely on Tinker's ingenuity. I don't think I've actually... Like, I know there isn't an armor augment that covers bleeding resistance. So getting bleeding resistance is a little tricky, especially if you're a spellcasting character. Generally speaking, like, bleed damage-related gear will probably carry bleed res. And then in Devotion is another way you can get your resistances up. Because in Devotion, there are certain nodes, like in the Vulture in the center here, has bleeding resistance. And then there's Vitality resistance there, Leech Life resistance. And you can generally pick up some good resistances as you go through Devotion now. It used to not be the case. It used to be something like, where's an example of it? It used to be that resistances were actually kind of sparse in here, and people were, for their defenses, like, going for Yulo, just because she gave elemental res. And this was something different in the middle here. I think it was was it Chaos? No. There was a resistance node in the middle here, and then there was the poison and chaos nodes there. And then you'd have, like, the poison here, the vitality res there, elemental res on the crane. So people were just going in here to fill out the resistances, and you can kind of still do that. But you'll generally pick up some resistances as you fill in the trees, the constellations you need, to pick up the abilities you want. So yeah, I needed stuff for chaos. Excuse me. So I picked up, you know, the Vulture, and that gave me some bleed and vitality res. And then if, like, you're gearing for, if you're trying to pick up, say, Spear of the Heavens, you'll end up with a smidgen of Aether resistance, smidgen of lightning resistance, in addition to your Aether and lightning damage. And that's pretty common throughout the Devotion constellations. So Ulzin's Torch has some Chaos res in the middle, which is really handy. Fire res is obviously in here as well. And a max fire res is on that node. So as you go through your Devotion abilities, you'll probably pick up a lot of the resistances similar to your gearing, where you'll pick up the resistances related to the ability. So, yeah, there's cold res, predictably enough, on Amatok Spirit of Winter, which is the cold damage, Eldritch Primordial constellation. And then if you come down, and I obviously don't have these nodes memorized, but I'll bet you we'll cross a cold resistance node in the Leviathan. Oh, there it is, Piercing Cold res. And that pretty much holds true for everything. Look at that. There's all 3 elemental resistances at 20% on that one. Abomination. There's your poison acid res. Because Abomination has the heavy poison emphasis. No chaos res though, which is kind of not supporting the hypothesis here. But oh, there's fire res on that one. That's a chaos fire thing. So yeah, gearing your character and picking up your devotion trees, your devotion constellations, you'll fill out a lot of resistances, and then you can generally use the armor augments to get the rest. And just to go over them, Devil's Crossing has Mogdragon's Touch, which is poison acid and vitality res, and Blade Ward Powder, which is the pierce res one. The Rovers have Venom Guard Powder, which is just poison acid res, and Nightshade Powder, which is pierce and cold. Homestead has Flameweave Powder, which is pierce and fire, and Soulstorm Powder, which is fire and lightning. The Black Legion has Kingsguard Powder, which is pierce and poison acid, and the very excellent Mankind's Vigil, which will give you Aether Chaos. And Aether Chaos are kind of more difficult damages to cover unless you're in those damage types, so that's a good one to pick up. The Outcast has Outcast Warding Powder, which is just Aether, Outcast Elemental Scales, which is fire and cold, and Outcast Skyguard Powder, which is cold and lightning. The Order of Death's Vigil has Wraith Touch Powder, which is cold, Spirit Guard Powder, which is vitality, and Spellword Powder, which is lightning and Aether. And lastly, Kaiman's Chosen has Kaiman's Blessing, which is fire, Kaiman's Conduit, which is lightning, and Demon Bane Powder, which is vitality and chaos resistance. So the last thing I'm going to touch on is prioritizing resistances if you really, really want to focus on gearing on them. the first thing you'd want to shoot for is obviously elemental. You'll encounter these 3 at a highly common rate in the game. Same thing with poison. When you think of the undead you fight in Act 1, there's pretty much an undead for each damage type of those 4. Except for lightning. And even then, with lightning, you still have the gazers. So these 4 are the ones you generally want to get to max, and then try to keep as max as possible. Pierce and probably bleeding would be next. Generally speaking, the first 5 are the more common ones, the second 5 are the less common ones. But piercing and bleeding, you'll encounter quite a bit of those, especially with piercing. When you go to fight like Cronley's guys, you'll encounter that damage type a lot. Bleeding, it is rarer, but you generally, when you encounter it, will get hurt by it. I know it sounds kind of funny, but when you hit with a bleed, you'll notice it about as much as a poison, and it can actually deal a lot of damage to you. So having bleed res is pretty important after these 4. After pierce and bleed, I would probably say chaos is your next most important because of all of the chthonics you'll fight. Ethereals, some of them do deal aether damage, but you'll mostly be dealing with the elemental damage types with them. The ones that deal aether damage are like the mages, obviously the aether crystal based enemies, but you'll be dealing with those far less than you'll be dealing with like the variety of undead that deal the elemental types. Vitality res, I'd probably say it's the lowest. It's one of those, like, it's hard to say when you get hit by it. You'll kind of know certain enemies do it, like Alcamos, Lord Executioner, and some of the undead that are ghostly, I think, deal vitality damage as well. Vitality damage, I believe it's either blue or red when it hits you. Like a very distinct red. When it's like an energy that hits you. Or it's purple, because Kilbrian does a lot of vitality damage as well. So, yeah, I'd probably tier it as elemental and poison, and then pierce, bleed, chaos. I'd probably say pierce, bleed, and chaos are all in their own second tier. And the reason I say chaos is second tier, despite a whole faction basically being chaos damage, is because you'll know when you're about to encounter it. Because the chthonics are in their specific areas, and if you want the extra chaos res, you're gonna go and throw on those augments. Because you can switch out your armor augments on the fly in order to shore up your damages you're low against. So, yeah, pierce, bleed, and chaos are your second tier things, and then your third tier are your aether and vitality. Vitality, just because it's one of those damages where you'll know a couple enemies that do it because it's their thing, but it's not that common to encounter on the mobs. And in aether, you'll know it's the same thing. You'll know what enemies do it, and generally speaking, you'll be dealing with the other damages more than aether anyways. So I think that is going to cover resistances in Grim Dawn. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was kind of a more conversationally done video than demonstration-y. You can check out my Patreon. You'll see a link on the screen, and in mentioning my Patreon, I will mention that the person who requested this video is a patron. So if you go on Patreon and contribute to the channel, you can request things of me to do for videos, whether they're Grim Dawn related or not. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.